Hi, it's Sandra from SandraD Imagery, and I'm going to break down the layers and some of the techniques that I use to create this nighttime image from a daytime image. So I'll start with the base layer. I'll just show you, taken in Norway, and I love the mountains and the lake and the foreground. But I know that I'm going to turn this into a nighttime image, and so what I'm going to do is replace the sky. And I normally replace the sky early in my workflow as opposed to later. It's easier to manage if you do it early. So let's come over to the layers panel. My first adjustment layer is levels, and I tend to use levels as opposed to curves, but that's just a personal preference for me. My next layer, layer 1, is a stamp visible layer. That's Control-Alt-Shift-E or Command-Alt-Shift-E, and what that does is compresses all the layers underneath into that one layer. Now I'll use that technique during my workflow for several reasons, and I'll explain them as we go along. Now I know that I'm going to replace the sky. I've got a night image or a night sky. I've done my adjustments on that, and now I'll turn on all the layers and you can see I've replaced the sky. Then is the next layer, and that's a stamp visible layer. Now what I want to do is add my element, and this is a simple composite image, virtually just one element, the old hut, and I'll turn that layer on, and I just felt it sat in the landscape and it looked realistic, but it's a little bit bright. So the next layer is what I call a color toning layer, and it's a clipping mask which clips down to the hut. I'll turn the layer on and you'll actually see that it tones it down. Now that color there I haven't chosen, Photoshop has chosen, and the technique that you use is filter, blur, average, and then Photoshop works out the average color that's within your scene, and it will come up with different colors. For this image it's chosen that sort of brown color. Now again, I'll look at my image and go, what am I happy with? What am I not happy with? Now I look at this area here and I'll go, I'm not liking that rock area, so I'm going to patch that up. So that is why I then do the next layer, layer 3, as a stamp visible. So I'll turn that layer on, and what I've done is selected an area from over here with my lasso tool, duplicated the layer which has put that selection into the next layer, and have a look at the bottom right hand corner, and I've done a quick patch up. So now I've got that working where I want. Again, it's a stamp visible layer, and I need to do that for my next layer, which is what gives me that nighttime look. So I'll turn that layer on, and this is where I use a LUT or a lookup, color lookup table. I'll turn the layer on, and you'll see now it's got that blue tones, that dark night tones. Now I'll just click on the layer, and you can see I've brushed away or masked away some of the areas that I didn't want that color to be. But if you haven't used a LUT or a color lookup table, come straight up to the adjustments panel, and there it is, a color lookup. Now when you click on that, you'll get some options, and from memory I've chosen the moonlight one, and that gives it that nighttime look. Now it's the base colors. I need to build the colors up a little bit more as I go along, but this is the start of my color grading. I'll turn that layer off and on, and so now I've got that rich deep blue that I'm after. The next layer is a stamp visible layer, but now this is where I'm going to deepen my color on the next layer. Now you can either use a solid color fill, you could use a gradient or a gradient map, but I've chosen a gradient, and I'll just turn that layer on, and you'll see that it is like a charcoaly grey blue, And what it's done, if you look over on the mask, you can actually see I've brushed out or masked out some of that colouring in some of the areas. I'll turn that off and on. Just gives me what I call that midnight blue tone that I was after. Now you can experiment with your colours. It depends on your image and what kind of blues or tones that you have in mind to create your image. Now I sit back and I go, I like the colours and the tones. What else can I do before I continue on in the workflow? And I think, oh, there's a chimney there. I could add some smoke. So that's what I've done. Very subtle. I'll just come in and you'll see there's just a little bit of smoke there that just gives it that illusion of smoke coming out of the chimney. Now, when I do any brush work, I always do it on a blank layer, and that means I can drop the opacity. So it's on 53% at the moment. If I put it up to 100, you'll see it's quite bright. So we'll just undo and get it down to around about 53. I experiment with my opacity quite a lot. The next layer is a stamp visible layer, and what I've done is a little brushwork, Photoshop brushwork over it. I've used some impressionist brushes, and so it gives it that painterly look. I'll turn that off and on. I'll use that technique just to soften. Again, it's my style for this image, and I'll experiment with different brushes and techniques. The next layer is a Nik software filter layer, and I've used classical soft focus, and that gives it a little bit of a glow. Now I'll come up and have a look at the opacity. It's 77%, so I've dialed that filter look down. Just wanted a little glow, not a lot. So now I add in a moon with one of my Photoshop brushes. The next layer is a levels, and I've used that just to boost up the mid-tones. Now I look at my image and I go, it's a little bit flat with light. This is one technique that you can use. There's many other ways, and so I've done a little bit of dodging in just certain areas. I'll turn that off and on, and I've just, as you can see on this level here, I've actually brushed in different places. Whenever I'm doing dodge and burn, I always do it on a grey layer. I never dodge and burn on a pixelated layer or a stamped visible layer. It's just one technique that I've learned from my landscape days that still stays with me. I've done a curves, and this is where I get a little bit more of a mid-tone pop. I'll turn that off and turn it on. I've now looked at my image and analysed, and I think this is just a little bit bright over here. So I've selected that area and I've put it into a levels adjustment layer. I'll turn that on. You can see over on the mask, there's the area that I've selected. So it's just got the eye not looking at that bright spot. Now let's have another look at the image, and I go, oh, that area over there is a little bit too bright now. So I'll do a little bit of burn. So I've just burned it down, and so it just makes it darker, and on the HUD as well. One technique, many other ways to do it. So now I'm looking at it and going, it's a bit too blue. What can I do with it? So the next layer is what I call a solid color fill, and I'll turn that layer on. And let's have a look at the blend mode. Soft light, and the opacity is 15%. I'm going to change that to normal and put that up to 100%, and you can actually see it is an inky blue. But once you use a blend mode and drop the opacity, it just gives it another level or depth of color. So I'll just undo and get it back to soft light and opacity at 15%. Let me turn that layer off and on. Now for me, with color grading, I build up my depth of color gradually, and I might even desaturate it a little bit, and then I'll build the color up again. It's how I get my depth of colour through my images. The next layer is another levels that gives it a little bit more of a pop. This is where I've used a hue and saturation, and I've desaturated. I've taken a little bit of the blue out, so I'll turn that layer off and turn it on. So now it's got a softer blue for my eye. Next is a stamp visible layer. My finishing touch for this image is a levels, and I've just adjusted the midtones and a little bit of lights in there. So I'll turn that layer off and on. So now I've got what I call the eye looking at the hut, and then the foreground, the beautiful red. My inspiration came from Van Gogh's colours, the blue and the orange and the yellows. And there's my last layer, layer 12, as a finishing stamp visible layer. It was a fun, creative image that I posted up on my social media page, and I tried some different techniques. And so that's how I turned a daytime image with good bones to work with into a nighttime image. It's all about having fun, experimenting with different techniques to see what you can achieve.